Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, you're about to hear one of the most powerful and inspiring true stories in American history. This is not just a story about escaping slavery, it's a story about unwavering courage, selfless leadership, and the deep human desire for freedom. It's the story of a woman who became a symbol of strength and hope for generations to come. She was born into a world of chains, cruelty, and silence, but she refused to stay silent. She risked her life countless times to lead others to freedom, armed with nothing but her faith, her determination, and the sheer power of her will. Her enemies called her a criminal. Her people called her a savior. This journey you're about to take will not only improve your English listening skills, it will also awaken something deeper in your heart, the belief that one person, even against impossible odds, can make a difference. You'll learn new vocabulary, hear rich expressions, and immerse yourself in a real-life adventure that shaped the soul of a nation. Get ready to travel back in time, to walk in the footsteps of a legend. Get ready for one of the most emotional, powerful, and motivational stories ever told. Let's begin the journey. She was born into darkness. Not the kind you see at night, but the kind that wraps around your whole life, a darkness called slavery. Around the year 1822, in Dorchester County, Maryland, a baby girl was born into bondage. Her birth name was Araminta Ross, but those who loved her called her Minty. She would later rename herself, as if reclaiming her identity from the chains that tried to erase it, and become Harriet Tubman. From the moment she entered the world, Harriet was someone else's property. Her parents, Harriet Rick Green and Ben Ross, were both enslaved. They lived in separate cabins, worked for different masters, and had no legal rights to protect their children. Their family could be, and would be, torn apart at any moment. The world Harriet was born into was merciless. Enslaved children were considered old enough to work as early as age 5. They were whipped for crying, sent into freezing swamps to trap muskrats, and hired out like tools to whoever needed labor. Harriet's earliest memories were not of play or laughter, but of pain and fear. She saw her sisters sold away, never to return. She watched her mother fight off slave traders with nothing but her bare hands to protect her family. These images burned themselves into Harriet's heart, teaching her something early on: freedom is precious, and it must be defended at all costs. Religion also played a powerful role in her upbringing. Her parents taught her to believe in God, not the version used by slave owners to justify cruelty, but the God of justice, of deliverance. She learned the stories of Moses, who led his people out of bondage in Egypt. As she listened, something stirred deep within her, not just faith, but fire. One day, she would be that kind of leader. Meanwhile, the world beyond Maryland was beginning to shift. Abolitionist movements in the North were growing louder. Tensions between slaveholding states and free states were escalating. Newspapers printed stories of brave escapes, uprisings, and whispers of a secret network called the Underground Railroad, not a real train, but a lifeline for those who dared to flee. But for Harriet, still a child, escape was only a distant dream. Survival came first. The whip cracked. The work never stopped. And childhood disappeared before it ever had a chance to begin. Yet somewhere in that harsh soil, something unbreakable was growing, a strength that would one day change the course of history. As Harriet grew older, the cruelty around her only deepened, and soon, it came for her directly. By the time she was just 6 years old, she was hired out to another household, far from her parents, to care for a baby. It was called being rented, as if she were an object, not a child. Harriet was forced to stay awake at night to rock the baby's cradle, and if the baby cried, she was whipped. Her small body bore the marks, but her spirit refused to break. When she failed to meet expectations, she was sent back, bruised, hungry, and ashamed. But there was no rest. Another master soon claimed her. Then another. And each time, she learned more about cruelty and about her own endurance. One of the most devastating moments came when Harriet was still a teenager. One day, she was in a general store when an overseer demanded she help restrain another enslaved man who was trying to flee. Harriet refused. The overseer, furious, threw a 2-pound metal weight at the man, but it struck Harriet in the head. She collapsed. Blood poured down her face. The injury was severe. For days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. When she finally recovered enough to move, her body was never the same. For the rest of her life, Harriet suffered from sudden spells, moments where she would fall asleep without warning, as if caught in a dream. They were terrifying, unpredictable, and a constant reminder of how close she had come to death. But something else changed in her after that injury, something deeper. During those spells, she began to experience vivid dreams and visions. She believed they were messages from God, guidance that would lead her path. Her faith, already strong, became her compass. And with every moment of cruelty, her belief in divine justice grew stronger. Around her, she saw what slavery really meant, families ripped apart without warning. Mothers screaming as their babies were taken away. People working from dawn until exhaustion with no hope of rest. Some gave in. Some went silent. But Harriet, she started to burn with questions. Why should anyone own another person? Why should children be born into chains? Why did no one stop it? These weren't just thoughts, they were the seeds of resistance. At night, when she could steal a moment of rest, she listened to whispered stories, of runaways, of abolitionists in the North, of stars that pointed toward freedom. She memorized the skies. She studied the woods. She paid attention to the movements of animals, the sounds of the wind, and the safest paths. She knew she couldn't stay. Harriet didn't just want freedom for herself, she wanted it for all those she loved. But for now, that dream was still locked away. She was watched. Controlled. And escape meant risking everything, even death. Still, in her heart, the decision was already made. It was not a matter of if, but when. The time had come. By her late 20s, Harriet knew she couldn't wait any longer. The risk of being sold deeper south, far from her family, into even harsher plantations, grew more real each day. She had seen what happened to those who waited too long, they vanished. No goodbyes. No hope. One night in 1849, Harriet made her decision. Her enslaver had died, and she feared the estate would soon be broken apart and the people sold off like cattle. She would not let herself become a name on an auction list. She whispered her plan to a few trusted friends. But she couldn't tell her mother. She knew that goodbye would break her. So, with a heavy heart and a mindset like iron, Harriet slipped into the night. She had no map. No guide. No certainty. Only the North Star, her faith in God, and her courage. The journey was grueling. She moved by night, hiding in swamps and thickets during the day. Every snapping twig was a threat. Every rustle of leaves could be a patrol. Slave catchers and their dogs were always near. The penalty for running away was brutal, whippings, mutilation, or worse. But Harriet kept going. She received help along the way, kind strangers, freed slaves, and abolitionists who were part of a growing secret network, the Underground Railroad. These weren't railroads in the traditional sense. There were no tracks or trains. But there were conductors, people who guided runaways from one station to the next, homes, churches, barns, each offering shelter and protection. Harriet eventually crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state. She later recalled, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now I was free." Freedom felt surreal, overwhelming in its beauty, but also incomplete. She had escaped. But her family had not. Most would have stopped there. Most would have tried to forget the past and start a new life in the North. But Harriet couldn't forget. Her dreams were filled with the voices of those she'd left behind. Their faces haunted her. She had tasted freedom, and she knew it would mean nothing if she couldn't share it. So, against all odds, Harriet made a decision that would change history. She would go back. Back into the South. Back into danger. Back into the very heart of slavery, not for herself, but for others. She would become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She trained herself to move without sound, to travel by the safest routes, to use coded songs and secret signals. She carried a pistol, not just for protection, but to remind those she guided that turning back could get them, and everyone else, killed. Harriet knew the cost. Each journey meant risking her life. But she believed something greater was at stake: dignity, humanity, and the promise that every person had the right to be free. The road ahead would be long. She would face betrayal, violence, and heartbreak. But with every step, she grew stronger. More determined. More legendary. She had walked herself to freedom. Now, she would walk hundreds more toward it. Each journey back into slave territory was like walking into a lion's den. But Harriet Tubman did not flinch. Between 1850 and 1860, she returned again and again, at least 13 daring trips, rescuing not only her own family, but more than 70 enslaved people personally, and indirectly helping hundreds more find their way to freedom. She never lost a single passenger. But it wasn't just the physical danger that tested Harriet's resolve, it was the pressure mounting from a changing America. In 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a cruel law that transformed every inch of the country, even free states, into a hunting ground for escaped slaves. Under this law, slave catchers could seize anyone they suspected of being a fugitive, with little proof. Worse, it required citizens, even in the North, to assist in capturing runaways, turning neighbor against neighbor. Harriet was now unsafe even in Pennsylvania. So she rerouted her missions to Canada, where British law had long abolished slavery. The journey became longer, colder, and far more dangerous. But Harriet adapted, finding new allies, creating more secret pathways, and learning to blend into any environment. It was during this time that her name began to echo across abolitionist circles, not just as a brave conductor, but as a symbol of the movement. People began calling her Moses, a leader delivering her people from bondage, just as in the biblical story. But this Moses carried no staff. Her weapons were cunning, faith, and an unbreakable spirit. Still, the toll was heavy. On one of her trips, she tried to rescue her husband, John Tubman. But he had remarried, and refused to leave. Harriet was devastated. But even in heartbreak, she found purpose. If she could not save the man she once loved, she would save others. Her mission was no longer personal, it was universal. She began working closely with abolitionists like William Still, who kept detailed records of fugitives and their stories, and Frederick Douglass, who praised her courage publicly. Yet even among allies, few truly grasped the extent of her heroism. Douglass once admitted that while he had spoken for freedom on stages, Harriet had acted for it in the shadows, in the thick of the battle. And the threats kept coming. Slave owners placed bounties on her head, some as high as $40,000, a fortune at the time. But Harriet was always 2 steps ahead. She disguised herself as an old woman. She carried chickens under her arms to distract guards. She used coded songs, like Wade in the Water, to guide fugitives to safety through rivers that masked their scent from dogs. One night, deep in the woods, she led a group that included a crying baby. Silence was essential. The baby's mother was terrified. Harriet took a rag, soaked it in a mild sedative, and gently pressed it to the child's mouth, praying the baby would sleep and live. They made it through. Every story added to her legend. Yet the greatest turning point in Harriet Tubman's journey came not with a rescue, but with a decision. She could not do this alone anymore. She began speaking publicly, raising funds, and urging others to join the cause. Though uneducated, she captivated audiences with raw honesty and divine conviction. People gave money, clothing, supplies, anything to support her next mission. She also worked with the newly formed Underground Railroad networks in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, becoming a central figure in one of the most daring resistance movements in American history. By the end of the 1850s, Harriet had become more than a conductor. She was a general in a secret war for justice. But as America stood on the brink of civil war, Harriet's fight was about to move from the underground to the battlefield. The 1860s arrived like a storm. The United States was fractured, North and South locked in a deadly ideological clash over slavery, states' rights, and freedom itself. In 1861, that tension exploded into the Civil War. And Harriet Tubman, though still a fugitive in the eyes of the law, didn't stay on the sidelines. She headed to South Carolina, not to fight with a weapon in hand, but with knowledge, strategy, and unmatched courage. The Union Army recognized her value. Who better to guide soldiers through Southern terrain than someone who had outwitted slave catchers for over a decade? She became a spy, scout, nurse, and military strategist, roles almost unheard of for women, especially black women, at the time. Working under the Union Army, Harriet helped map unfamiliar regions, gather intelligence from enslaved people, and even lead raids. Her most daring mission during the war was the Combahee River Raid in 1863, the only military operation in U.S. history led by a woman that freed over 700 enslaved people in a single night. Imagine the scene, Union gunboats gliding silently up the river. Harriet, now in her 40s, leading the charge, coordinating troops, guiding them through the swamps of South Carolina. Plantations burned behind them. Hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children ran toward the boats, toward freedom. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a symbol. Harriet Tubman had not only rescued dozens through the Underground Railroad, she had now liberated hundreds through a military campaign. But these victories came at great personal cost. Harriet earned almost nothing for her war service. Despite risking her life repeatedly, she was never paid a soldier's wage. She lived in poverty for years after the war, often relying on friends or speaking engagements to survive. Her body was worn, and her health deteriorated. The injury she'd suffered as a child, the blow to her head, had long-term effects, frequent seizures, headaches, and visions. Still, she never stopped. After the war, Harriet continued fighting, this time for women's rights and for the dignity of the poor and the elderly. She gave speeches alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, arguing that black women, too, deserved the vote. She also opened her home in Auburn, New York, to the elderly and sick, founding the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a place where people who had nowhere else to go could find safety and care. And in every speech, every interview, every appearance, she reminded people, her fight was never about glory. It was about justice. One reporter once asked her, "What gave you the courage to go back, again and again?" She replied simply, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." But beneath that answer was something deeper, a soul shaped by suffering, carved by sacrifice, and filled with purpose. Harriet Tubman's choices weren't easy. She risked her life every time she returned to slave territory. She lived with constant physical pain. She endured heartbreak, rejection, and the loneliness of leadership. And yet, she chose freedom, not just for herself, but for others. She could have fled and stayed safe. But she didn't. She could have become bitter from betrayal and injustice. But she didn't. She could have retreated into silence. But instead, she raised her voice louder. In the end, Harriet Tubman's greatest weapon was not her strength or stealth, it was her unyielding belief in human dignity, even when the world around her denied it. As the war ended and slavery was finally abolished, many saw it as the conclusion of her mission. But for Harriet, it was only the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one for equality, education, and true freedom. The Moses of America had led her people through the desert of bondage. Now, she would fight to ensure they could thrive in the promised land. The war had ended. Slavery was abolished. The chains had been broken, at least legally. But Harriet Tubman understood that true freedom wasn't just the absence of bondage. It meant dignity, opportunity, and a future. And so, she didn't stop. In Auburn, New York, where she had settled years earlier, Harriet turned her small home into a sanctuary, not for herself, but for those still struggling. She opened her doors to freed slaves, the elderly, the poor, and the sick. Many of these people had nowhere to go in the years following the war. Society, though free, remained deeply unequal. Harriet, now aging and physically fragile, tended to the sick with her own hands. She cooked, cleaned, and prayed with them. She took in anyone in need, veterans, orphans, widows, and did it not as charity, but as a continuation of her life's work, lifting up those society cast aside. This spirit of service led her to establish the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged in 1908. She donated the land, raised funds, and worked tirelessly to ensure it would serve people long after she was gone. It became a place of care and hope, just like the safe houses on the Underground Railroad once were. At the same time, Harriet took on a new public role. Though never formally educated, she became a powerful speaker and activist. She spoke at gatherings for women's suffrage, civil rights, and temperance. Her voice, firm, clear, and full of conviction, inspired audiences across the nation. At women's suffrage rallies, she was often the only black woman on stage. Standing beside leaders like Susan B. Anthony, she brought a unique and powerful message. "I fought for freedom long before I had the right to vote," she reminded the crowd. Her presence forced the nation to confront not just gender inequality, but the double burden of race and gender that women like her had endured. And finally, recognition began to come. Though she had been denied proper military compensation for years, Congress eventually granted her a modest pension for her role as a nurse during the Civil War, not for her espionage or military strategy, which remained unrecognized during her lifetime. But even with limited resources, Harriet lived with purpose and joy. She sang spirituals, told stories, and offered wisdom to younger generations who came to her for guidance. To them, she wasn't just a historical figure, she was living proof that one person, with enough faith and courage, could change the course of history. Children who visited her home would sit wide-eyed as she recounted tales of escape, hiding in swamps, guiding entire families north by the stars. Many called her Aunt Harriet, a term of deep respect and affection. And across the country, her name became a symbol of strength, resilience, and moral clarity. She had done the impossible, over and over again. She had defied laws, survived danger, and outwitted the most powerful system of oppression in the nation. She had led hundreds to freedom, helped win a war, and built a new life not just for herself, but for countless others. And she did it all without ever asking for praise. Near the end of her life, she said, "I go to prepare a place for you." It was a phrase from the Bible, but when Harriet Tubman said it, it carried special weight. She had spent her whole life preparing places, safe places, for those in danger. Now, even as her body weakened, her spirit remained strong. She was more than a conductor, more than a nurse, more than a speaker. She was a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. And though her journey was nearing its end, her legacy was just beginning. Harriet Tubman passed away on March 10, 1913, at approximately 91 years old. As she lay surrounded by friends, family, and those she had helped, her final words echoed the life she had lived. "I go to prepare a place for you." It was fitting. She had spent nearly every moment of her life doing exactly that, preparing a place, a path, a possibility, for those who came after her. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. She was buried with military honors, one of the few black women to receive such a distinction at the time. But the honors, medals, and ceremonies could never capture the full scope of what she had done. Her real legacy lived not in stone or speeches, but in the lives she saved, the people she inspired, and the ideals she carried like a torch through the darkness. What makes Harriet Tubman's story endure is not only her bravery, but her unyielding moral clarity. At a time when the law, the culture, and even the church accepted slavery as normal, she saw it for what it was, a crime against humanity. And she didn't wait for permission to fight it. She followed her conscience, and her God, with unshakable faith. Her legacy is also one of extraordinary personal resilience. Harriet faced more adversity than most can imagine: physical abuse, lifelong illness from a head injury, poverty, and prejudice. Yet none of it broke her. Each obstacle only deepened her resolve. In a world that often told her she was worthless, she proved the opposite, not by shouting or seeking power, but by lifting others up. She showed the world what one person could do, not with wealth, status, or formal education, but with courage, compassion, and purpose. Today, Harriet Tubman is remembered as one of the greatest Americans to have ever lived. Her name graces schools, museums, libraries, and soon, the U.S. $20 bill, a powerful recognition for someone who was once considered less than property by the country she would help transform. But beyond monuments and currency, her spirit lives on in the hearts of those who fight for freedom, dignity, and justice in their own ways. Every time someone takes a stand against injustice, Every time someone protects the vulnerable. Every time someone risks comfort to do what's right. They walk a little in the footsteps of Harriet Tubman. And in that way, she's still with us, guiding, inspiring, reminding us that even in the darkest night, one brave soul can light the way. Dear learners, we've reached the end of an unforgettable journey, the life of a woman whose courage lit the path to freedom for so many. Harriet Tubman didn't have wealth, didn't have formal education, and wasn't born into power. What she had was a heart full of conviction, a soul that refused to rest while others were suffering. Her story reminds us that you don't need to be mighty to make a mighty difference. She lived a life of purpose, not comfort, of action, not excuses. And though she faced fear, betrayal, and danger at every turn, she kept going, because the lives of others depended on her strength. Through this story, you haven't just improved your English listening skills, you've stepped into the life of a true hero. You felt her fear, her bravery, her sorrow, and her triumphs. And hopefully, you found something that stays with you, a lesson in humanity, perseverance, and the power of one. So now, carry her message with you. Be the person who speaks for those without a voice. Be the light for someone in the dark. Be the strength someone else can lean on. If Harriet Tubman's story touched you, share it. Talk about it. Let it inspire others. Let it move more hearts. And if you haven't already, like, comment, and subscribe to WSE True Stories. Not just for English practice, but to keep discovering stories that awaken the best in us all. Until next time, dear learners. Keep learning. Keep dreaming. Keep believing. Goodbye for now.